Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the public information session for the response activity plan for Villages of Parkside 1A and 1B in Detroit. My name is Mike Gurney. I'm with the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy in our Environmental Support Division. I have just a couple quick housekeeping slides. I'm going to be mostly in the background this evening, making sure hopefully Zoom works as best as possible. So I will try and set the table here very briefly and then hand it over to Martha and Carrie to get us started. So a couple things. We are recording this meeting tonight, so that will be two outcomes. Number one, we're going to post it to EGLE's YouTube page. So it should be by the end of the week. The link should be active. You can share that with anyone who was not able to attend tonight. You can come back and rewatch if there's highlights that you need to revisit. We also will intend to send an email to everybody who registered for this meeting. You'll get a link to the recording. We'll also provide a copy of the slide deck from tonight. All lines are muted during the presentation, but we can still get questions from you, and we'll hope to have a lot of time at the end for Q&A. And so make sure to submit your questions throughout the presentation today. You can use the Q&A function in your Zoom toolbar. Just one thing to keep in mind, and Martha will talk about it too, we're really focused right on this response activity plan that was sent in. And so we're going to do our best to keep questions focused to that. I know there's a lot of questions, and especially if you have comments on the plan, we're in the middle of a public comment period. We'll have a slide set up later in the presentation to show you exactly how you can send in written public comments. And I apologize, there's a cat in my room. So keep an eye out for that slide. And with that, I will kick the cat out and hand slides over to Martha and Carrie.
Excellent.
Looks
Thank
good,
you.
thanks.
Thank you so much, Martha, for getting that up. And thank you all for your interest in this project and for spending some time with us tonight as we talk about it. So bear with me as I try and have Martha advance slides as we go here. Martha, can you go to the next one? So before we dive in, thought we'd spend a second talking about who we are. I am Carrie Geyer. I manage EGLE's Brownfield program. And Martha Thompson, who is going to carry the bulk of the load tonight, is our housing redevelopment specialist. And so she'll get into some of the specifics after I lay down a little bit of just high level groundwork. We have a couple additional panelists joining us today. Regina Strong will be here. She's our environmental justice public advocate. And Nick Swiger is our technical support section manager, and he is really our technical guru in our division. Next. So why are we here today? We're here today to talk about a response activity plan, aka RESAP is what we call those for short, that was submitted to EGLE for review. It's because we feel like there's significant public interest in this project. We have established a public comment period for this response activity plan. It began December 1st and will extend to the end of January. So January 30th is the last day for public comment. And we're here today to give you a little overview of what that RESAP contains and hopefully answer some of your questions. So our agenda is just that. We're going to give you an overview of our role. We're going to talk about what we're reviewing, give you some background and information on the site, summarize what the proposed actions are for the site. And then we'll talk about how do you submit comments if you have them. And again, then we'll leave some time at the end for your questions. Next slide, Martha. So I wanted to start here, kind of at a high level, to talk about what's EGLE's role in development projects typically. EGLE is a big umbrella that has many divisions that do very different things, all tied to environmental. And that ranges from the drinking water and environmental health division that focuses on drinking water sources and making sure that those are clean and safe for use. The water resources division that focuses on kind of surface water things, wetlands, lakes, streams, storm waters, floodplains, that type of thing. Our air quality division does emissions and asbestos regulation. All of those things are definitely aspects of development that there are aspects of projects that development or aspects of environmental activities that development projects encounter. But remediation and redevelopment is where Martha and I live. And what we focus on is contaminated soil and contaminated groundwater. That's really what our expertise is in. Next slide. And so our role here is a couple things. It's basically to look at, if there is contamination in the soil or groundwater, how do we address that to make sure that it's safe for the proposed reuse? So we're going to confirm safe use of a property that has contamination in the soil or groundwater, and soil vapor is a result of contamination in the soil. And then the other piece is to make sure that whatever those actions are that are undertaken to make that property safe, that they remain in place and that folks are safe in the future on this property. So we call that compliance with due care or due care obligations. It's what an owner needs to do to make sure a property remains safe for the proposed use. And what we don't do, I want to really emphasize this because I think there's sometimes confusion when a site comes into our team for environmental review. It's a very focused, and it's really those areas of environmental contamination in the soil and groundwater. It, we don't weigh in on site selection, local site plan approvals, any of the funding requirements or decisions associated with that funding. And we don't get engaged in regulation of all those other things that fall under the umbrella of other EGLE divisions like lead paint, asbestos abatement, wetlands, endangered species, etc. So we're really focused on contaminated soil, contaminated groundwater, and how do we make sure folks are protected adequately for the reuse. Next slide, please. There we go. So how do we do that? Basically, what we see are environmental submittals that come into us. And the most common, there's different forms of these submittals, but the most common are what we call response activity plans, which is what we're here to talk about today, and documentation of due care compliance. And so what a response activity plan is basically, it's exactly that. It's a plan. It's what someone is planning to do to address the contamination on a property to make it safe for those proposed uses. So they'll lay out, here's what we know about the site, here's the conditions of the site, and here's what we plan to do to make sure it's safe. We review that, we determine if we feel that it's adequate or not, and then we provide our response to that plan. So assuming that a plan is approved, the second phase of the submittals come after the development is done and all of the activities that were laid out in the plan have been completed. And so that's what we call the documentation of due care compliance in this case. And what they do is they have to document that they actually did the work to make that property safe. So that can result in a whole bunch of data, that can result in pictures, things that they need to do to show to us and prove to us that they did the things they need to do to make sure it's safe. So there's kind of two pieces when we're asked to do an environmental review for a site, the requirements of what's included in these submittals, and the review process is laid out in our environmental regulation part 201, and that's referenced here below. Next slide, please. And now I'm going to turn it over to Martha, and she's going to get into the meat and potatoes here of what due care is and then the plan itself. So go ahead, Martha.
Thank you. So Carrie just talked about due care, and due care is part of Part 201. It is not an optional thing. It is required under the law for any owner or operator of contaminated property. And we have here on our screen the really the highlights of what due care means to any owner or operator. So they're making sure the property is being used safely. It depends obviously on the property use. It's the difference between, what is a school or a hospital versus what is an industrial facility. So it's very use dependent. They're going to notify the affected parties. In other words, making sure people who are going to use this property or who access this property know what is there and how to protect themselves. They're also required to maintain their protective measures throughout ownership and operation. So, what they contain in their plan, what they propose in their plan, and then what they execute and carry out down the road, they have to maintain those measures to continually prevent exposure. And that might include things like inspections and record keeping and maintaining barriers, things like that. It is also self-implemented. The owner operator is responsible for doing their own due care. That is not something the state comes in and does for them. It is an obligation of the owner or operator. So they are required to maintain the compliance documentation. So they have to keep all their records to show that they've done what they needed to do to prevent exposure, make sure the property is used safely, and that they've told the right folks that need to know what is going on. So when we talk about exposure and we talk about due care and preventing any harmful exposure, we are looking at how that happens. What are the routes of exposure? How does a person get exposed? Um, the first thing, all these five things have to be present before an exposure can occur. So the first thing that has to be present is a source of the contamination. So in this case, it's contaminated fill material. At some other properties, like say, for example, a gas station or something, that source of contamination might be the underground storage tank that stores the gasoline. The second thing that needs to be present is an environmental media and transport mechanism. So we have to have soil or groundwater present, and the transport mechanism is how does that contamination move through that media? So how is it going through groundwater? How is it coming into soil vapor? Those kinds of things. The third point is a point of exposure. And this is where the person gets exposed to the contamination, such as drinking from a private well, the building itself being the point of exposure, or green space if we're talking about touching contaminated soil. The fourth place, or the fourth point, is a route of exposure, and that is how it happens. It's material that's eaten, it's ingested by drinking, it's something that's breathing or touching. And then the fifth thing that has to be present is a receptor population, and that's a fancy way of saying people are there and people can be exposed for that type of thing. So again, all five of these points have to be present in order for that exposure to occur. So if we're thinking about this kind of globally, um, we have these things, and if one of these things is not present, let's say that it doesn't have a route of exposure, no one can eat something containing contamination, no one can drink it, no one can breathe it, then that means the exposure can't occur. So that just kind of gives you some idea about how we start to look at these things in determining what the potential risk might be to someone who's using or accessing the property. So when we receive a response activity plan and we conduct the environmental review here at EGLE, um, we ask ourselves several questions for each site to make sure we're following kind of a consistent process. We want to know, what are the site conditions? What is special about the site? What is the site used for now? And what is the proposed use that the owner wishes to use it for? Is there contamination present? I mean, typically by the time someone gets to the RESAP stage, they know that contamination is present because this RESAP contains their plan to mitigate or deal with the contamination. Um, is there an exposure risk present? What do we think the basis for that is? Is it accurate? Are we looking at how those routes of exposure that we just covered in the slide before? And then we want to look at what the plan is. How is the owner or operator proposing to mitigate or notify or otherwise, deal with the contamination to prevent exposure. And then we want to know what their plan is for continued operation and maintenance. What do they intend to do once the mitigation measure is constructed, once the exposure barrier is built, for example? We want to know how often they plan to inspect it, how they'll document those inspections, and how they'll continue to maintain that in perpetuity to make sure that no one is exposed to the contamination. For this particular site, as most of you who are here, you know that we're talking about the proposed Parkside Villages redevelopment phases 1A and 1B. And just wanted to give you a little bit of site background for what we know to be present based on the submittals that we have received about this property. We know that this area was originally developed as part of a Public Works Administration project at the end of the 1930s. It was constructed originally, the whole development on a 31-acre vacant lot that's next to Chandler Park in the city of Detroit. That functioned as a housing community for many, many years. It started to be demolished and razed starting in 1999 until 2005. And the property was then vacant and fenced at that time to prevent anyone from accessing it until the future plans could be developed to know what it would be reused for. In 2014, EGLE came out to the property. We were then called DEQ. That may ring a bell for some of you. And we completed some sampling to evaluate the surface soils at this property to determine if contamination was present based on a development plan that was in place at the time. And it included a school and some other residential type functions. It was not the same as what is in front of us today, but that was kind of a preliminary process where EGLE came in and was using state funds to do some initial investigation. That plan did not come to fruition. And then later, by 2024, the Detroit Housing Commission has partnered with Genosco Development Company to redevelop the property for housing. So this is another proposed use that is in front of us right now. And now in 2025, we've seen two submittals on this particular property. We did review a res app that's a different type than what's in front of us today. The first res app that we reviewed earlier this year and approved in April was what we call an evaluation plan. And that just means that that res app contained a scope of work that the prospective owner operator planned to carry out in order to characterize the site to determine the levels of contamination and what might require mitigation. So some additional data needed to be collected. They got EGLE's approval on that, and now they're at the stage where the current res app in front of us presents the plan for how they're going to mitigate any exposures at the property based on the data that they collected earlier this year that they planned to do. So the current property status hasn't changed much since the original buildings were demolished. It is vacant, it is fenced, and there, as you can see on the screen, the bright green outline is our approximation of where that property boundary is, and this is an image from Google Earth. You can see there is a access road through the eastern half of the property that still exists, but mostly it's vegetated and has a few trees in there, but it is not currently actively used for any purpose.
Martha,
So,
we have a question
sure,
that I think might be good to talk to or to speak to right now, which is, can you define some of the terms that you are using? Like, what is contamination?
of course. Good question. So contamination means that something is present in soil or groundwater that causes an adverse effect. This doesn't always mean something to a human. It could just mean it damages the soil. It causes pollution. Pollution is another term that I think is equivalent to contamination. What we kind of think of it in our world is somebody spills something, somebody spills a chemical, somebody spills gasoline, or let's say that someone is storing a hazardous chemical is part of their normal operations and it leaks somewhere and it leaks into the soil or it leaks into the groundwater and causes contamination. If you're trying to visualize something like this, it could mean surface staining, it could mean a sheen on a water surface. It could mean an odor is present that smells like something that has been spilled or the chemical that has been spilled. So basically, we're just looking at um, the nature of the pollution that we think is present on the property. So that's what we mean when we're talking about contamination. And those examples I gave are typically, how you would notice that is there. I will say for this property, the contamination that's present in the fill material that was used to backfill the old building foundations, it is not obviously visible from the surface. This is not a stained area or, a puddle with a sheen on it. There is no odor coming off of the property that indicates the contamination, is obviously present. These are things that have been sampled by collecting soil samples and by drilling into the ground or digging into the ground. Um, and that's where the evidence of the contamination has been noted. And the samples typically, when we're collecting from the soil or the groundwater, those get sent to a laboratory, and the laboratory tells us which are the compounds that are present. They run it through their machines, and that's how we can be specific about the type of contamination that is present at a property. So I hope that helps to kind of give some information and some background about what we mean when we say contamination. So to kind of get back to where our response activity plan is, again, what's in front of us now is a plan for mitigation. The data has been collected already that shows the contamination is present on the site. And I will get into what those types of contaminants are in just a couple of slides so that we can talk specifically about this development. But what I'm sharing on the screen right now is what the use is proposed to look like in the future. So we've got areas that look gray, dark gray, kind of like some gray balloons on there. Those are going to be the pavement areas, so parking lots and walkways and things like that. You see dashed lines on the screen that show kind of some rectangles with some little pop outs in them. Those are the proposed buildings that the developer wants to put on the property, where the apartment buildings will be situated. And then we have areas of the property that have little dots around them. And I know that's a little bit hard to see, but um, those dots indicate those areas are going to be green space. So we consider green space to mean grass covered lawn or, shrubs or trees or landscaping. So that is how the developer wishes to use the property for housing in the future. So for this particular thing, when we have a response activity plan that's in front of us, it contains, three main points. The first one is it gives us a summary of what's been done at the site, what the type of data and samples that have been collected so far. It provides us with maps that show where those samples have been collected, and it gives us tables of results that once the laboratory results are received and we know all those compounds of contaminants that are present there, that's all summarized in tables, and it gives us concentrations. So like a numeric value for how much of that contaminant is present. Or if there's a contaminant that was not detected, that will also show up in those tables. So it's a report that has come together and includes all those pieces. That report will also talk about what we call a conceptual site model. And that term basically means tell me about the site. What are the soil types present on the site? How deep is groundwater at the site? How does the topography look? The surface, is it a rolling hills? Is it flat land? Is it, hills and valleys? How does that property present itself? What does it look like? Basically, all the information that makes that property unique. We want to know what that conceptual site model is because that's how we make decisions. We want it to be very site specific. It will talk about what the history of the property is, kind of what I went through in the prior slides, so that we know what historic operations the property had and different types of things that may have been used on the site. For this one, we know it was residential, so we aren't looking at industrial uses. We aren't looking at commercial uses, um, but we are concerned about the material that was used to backfill the former building foundations and that may have been deposited on the property over time. By geology, we mean what are the soil types? What are we, do we have sand? Do we have clay? Do we have mixtures of different things? Do we have debris noted in some of the soil samples and some of the borings that we've drilled out there or that have been drilled? You know, kind of what does that look like? And so that conceptual site model is usually described in the text, in the words of the report. And it may also include maps that are cross sections, you know, that show kind of a slice of the property. So visually we can see you know, what are the soil types based on depth?
Martha,
Yes,
can you speak to, since you're talking about geology and conceptual site model, um, groundwater? We have a question in the chat about is groundwater, are we referring to water that comes out of the faucet? And is there groundwater on this site that we need to be concerned about?
absolutely. I can address that. So when we're talking about groundwater, we're talking about the level underground that natural water is present. So what I immediately think about is let's say just for to illustrate the point, we're at a beach and they're on the beach at closest to the water is very close to the surface and in some cases at the surface. If you are farther up the beach, closer to maybe where vegetation is or where beach homes are or where a dune may be, and you're climbing up in elevation, that water where the surface water is may be deeper underground. So the water stays kind of the same level, but as the ground level topography changes, that that changes the depth that you measure down to the water. So this is water that's naturally occurring beneath the ground. At this particular site in the city of Detroit, their groundwater was not encountered. They have drilled to a maximum depth of 20 feet below the existing groundwater or existing surface, and they didn't find wet or saturated soils. They didn't find water in a boring where that they could pump out and sample. So there really is not shallow groundwater present at this site. Um, I'm hoping that that helped to kind of give a picture of what we're talking about here. Groundwater does not always mean the water that comes out of your faucet. In the city of Detroit, properties and this property will also be connected to the city water system. So that means there are pipes underground that deliver that water to the property. The buildings have, you know, infrastructure inside of them that connect to those pipes so that the water comes up in through the building and to your faucet so you drink it. That is water that's supplied from the water treatment plant, not from groundwater on the property. There are other areas in Michigan where there might be a drinking water well on the property where there are pipes down into the ground to access the water, and that may come up through similar pipes and into a faucet in someone's home, but that is not the case for this site. The natural geology does not support that, and the city of Detroit provides drinking water to its residents through their municipal system. So that is how the water gets to the faucet. There are no wells currently on this property, so no one has drilled anything to try to get to water or would be able to pull water out. And we are confident that that will not be part of the property's future use because the developer intends to connect to the municipal water or city water in this case. So hopefully that helps answer the question. So to jump back to the third piece of our response activity plan, it will contain a summary of how the developer wishes to mitigate. So how, in this case, how exposure barriers will be constructed to meet EGLE's guidelines. We have different guidelines for different types of properties. This would be considered a managed residential property. And those exposure barriers have been designed to eliminate contact hazards, in other words, touching the soil once they're constructed. The summary also tells us that contaminated soil that's present on the property will be excavated in the building footprints. From the prior slide, the little dotted areas that showed the buildings there, to eliminate any vapor hazards, in other words, the breathing hazard that may be present from the contaminated fill material that's there. It also tells us how the notices will be made and what they will say. And those notices are for folks that may contact the contamination. If utility companies come onto the property to fix the water main or fix a sewer break or something like that, these notices tell them that there may be contamination present that they may come into contact with, and they need to prevent, exposure. It also will tell the residents if there are prohibited activities. So if there's an exposure barrier here, which is what is planned to do, the residents won't be able to dig in-ground gardens or plant things in through that exposure barrier that would breach that, to allow touching of the contaminated soil. So there are certain activities that won't be allowed there. It also gives EGLE a sample plan for operation and maintenance. So in other words, how they plan to inspect the exposure barriers, how often they will make the visual inspections, and how they will document that, what kinds of records they will be keeping about maintaining that. And as we talked about in a prior slide, that's meeting their due care obligations, and they'll maintain all of those records so that they can always demonstrate that they are in compliance and that they've done the inspections. If damage is noted during an inspection, they have an obligation to repair it. And that operation and maintenance plan tells us at EGLE how they plan to repair it and what damage means. If it's a hole, or if it's dead vegetation, or it's some other way that indicates that that barrier has been damaged, that needs to be repaired, with usually within 2 weeks. And if it can't be, it has to be prevented access to it, if that means fencing or some other way, that no one can touch that until the repair is made and that is restored to its pre-existing condition. Our goal here, as always with any response activity plan, is to make sure all of these pieces are put together, that helps us to make a good, safe decision on whether this plan may work. And we describe that in our language as saying it has a reasonable likelihood of protecting occupants. And that's kind of a wordy way of saying, is this going to work? Is this going to protect people from being exposed to the contamination that is present? So when I talked about before, when EGLE went out to the site in 2014 and did some sampling to evaluate the surface soils, this is a map showing how those areas were divided up. The circles represent some places where soil borings were drilled into the ground to collect soil samples. And the other kind of black and white outlines divide the area into kind of pieces of a pie. And I know it's not pie shaped, but it's divided into pieces. Then these areas were grids were developed in the areas, and smaller increments of soil or dirt essentially were pulled up from each spot. They were mixed together and sent off to the laboratory to show, what is here, what is representative of these areas. This obviously is a much larger area than the development that's in front of us today. This looked at a much larger parcel, and we're only looking at phases 1A and 1B at this time, which is just the southern portion of this. But I wanted to kind of give you an idea of how this was divided up so that we could do that grid sampling to collect the soil from across the site and see if there were contamination present in the surface material. More recently, in 2024 and this year in 2025, the developer's consultant has gone out to the site and sampled in many locations as well. And the little green circles and brown circles are locations where, again, borings have been drilled into the ground to collect soil samples to determine where the contamination is, how deep the contamination is, and confirm, the lateral spread of the contamination, so how far in either direction that goes. And it's been checked in the building footprints. If you remember what we talked about before with the dashed lines being the building footprints and the darker shading representing pavements and walkways and parking lots. There have been a lot of samples collected out at this site to really try to characterize the type of contamination that is present and how widespread this contamination is, where the backfill material is that was contaminated. And again, to recap before, groundwater or water, naturally occurring water in the ground was never encountered when they did drilling out here, and they went as deep as 20 feet below ground surface to evaluate that. So they just collected soil samples here, and they also, in the lighter green areas, collected some soil vapor samples, which just means naturally occurring gas or air mixtures that are just present in the ground surface anywhere. So if you envision that I've got a drinking glass full of ice, but no water in it, you can envision that the ice is the soil and the voids that where there's no water in there or where um, you have kind of an opening where there isn't an ice cube, that would be where the gas or air hangs out. And so that's what was sampled in that piece. And then that just kind of gives you a visual of how we think of the different types of things that may be present and how those samples are gathered. I hope that didn't confuse someone. That just came off the top of my head. So the results of the site assessment that have been done in 2014 when EGLE was out there, again, we gridded that area to get all little, pieces of soil were put together to sample. And then in 2024 and 25, that's when the developer had work out there where they bored into the ground to collect soil samples. And we call those discrete samples versus the grid samples, which just means it's one point where one, you know, certain volume of soil was put into a jar and then sent off into the laboratory. Things weren't collected together in a grid fashion. So we did discover, or we know now, and the developer discovered that fill material that was historically placed on the site was found to contain the contamination. And the types of contamination that were found there include metals and volatile organic compounds, which just means organic compounds that have the ability to volatilize into air. And semi-volatile are just another class of that, just means it's not as likely to volatilize as a volatile organic compound. And I'll get some more specifics later, actually on this slide. So for the metals, we detected, or what was detected out there in soil included arsenic, barium, cadmium, chromium, copper, lead, mercury, selenium, silver, and zinc. And that may sound kind of astounding or alarming. It is not. A lot of these metals are naturally occurring in soil. It doesn't mean that their presence is going to cause harm. We look at the levels of those metals that have been measured by the laboratory in the soil sample to determine if there is contamination present and if that contamination might cause an exposure. So out of all those metals that were found in the soils, only arsenic and lead were found above the direct contact or the touching exposure pathway criteria. And of the arsenic concentrations that are present there, they are actually within the acceptable regional naturally occurring levels in Michigan. And EGLE has done surveys in the past to determine what those naturally occurring levels are. So in other words, anywhere in Michigan, you can find this arsenic present at a certain concentration or within a range. So it doesn't mean that something is going to hurt you if it's within that naturally occurring range. We also found lead in one sample from 7 to 8 feet deep. So this was in one of the boring samples where it was just one soil sample from the bottom of the boring that exceeds the touching criteria. And based on all this data collected, the proposed mitigation, which is the direct contact exposure barrier, will prevent exposure to any of these metals that were detected. And in particular, the 7 to 8 foot one, no one who is living on the property as a resident is going to be touching that material at 7 to 8 feet below the ground surface. That it's just not part of our exposure scenario or reasonable to expect someone is going to touch the dirt essentially that is that deep. So again, we have metals that are detected here. Only arsenic and lead were above the numbers that we use for direct contact. And those numbers for arsenic are actually within naturally occurring levels all around Michigan. And the lead that was found was in a very deep sample that no one can touch. So for the other contaminants that were present that I talked about, the volatile organic compounds and the semi-volatile organic compounds, there were just a handful of them discovered in the contaminated fill material. The first one is a chemical called benzoapyrene. It is a common petroleum compound. So in other words, this may be found in fuels or in oils or in things that are petroleum based. And it was found above the direct contact criteria in the surface soil. So the touching criteria again. And this result actually came from the data that EGLE collected from the property in 2014. So this is present above, our number that indicates there could be a touching hazard with that chemical. There were also other compounds that were detected above criteria for breathing in the soil, but they weren't at a level that would necessarily mean a hazard is present um, in some areas, but in other areas where it was in the contaminated fill material, the developer is going to remove that hazard and prevent exposure by excavating it from building footprints. So again, based on the data for the volatile organic compounds and the semi-volatile organic compounds, the proposed mitigation will prevent exposure. So the direct contact exposure barrier will prevent anyone from touching, and excavation in the building footprints removes that contaminated soil from where, it can't be beneath the building, so no one can breathe it coming into the building. Again, it's removing one of those 5 steps to how someone can be exposed to the contamination. So when we talk about, I've mentioned exposure barriers a couple different times. Um, the direct contact exposure barrier example is on the left side of your screen, and that is kind of what I talked about before with a cross section. So you can see that you've got different soil types here. This would be something that someone might use as their conceptual site model. So it tells us where, different types of soils were encountered. Um, and this also shows what will be constructed at the property. So it's going to consist of a bright orange fabric that is marked with words that say "do not dig" in English and Spanish on that fabric. And that is laid over the top of the contaminated soil that will remain in place. That's not in the building footprint. So this is the touching hazard. And then on top of that bright orange fabric, there'll be 12 inches of clean fill material that will be tested and verified to be clean before it arrives on the site. That'll be placed on top of the fabric. And then on top of that clean soil will be vegetation. So that it'll be seeded, it'll be planted, it'll be watered so that grass grows there. And you'll have a 12-inch barrier that prevents anyone from touching what's beneath that orange fabric. And that is a number that we have determined protects safely from any exposure for a residential property like this. And that barrier has to be maintained. So The developer will need to always inspect that on a regular basis. They'll need to document that. They'll need to take pictures, and they'll need to maintain all of that to show that that barrier stays intact, it stays functioning and working to prevent anyone from touching the soil. And that's also why um, you won't be able to dig into that clean soil to breach that fabric or plant something that may breach that fabric, because beneath that fabric is where the touching hazard may be present. In addition to that, the sidewalks and the pavements will also act as a barrier, and those are a little bit different to maintain, as I'm sure you can imagine, because it's concrete or asphalt pavement that it doesn't degrade with weather, and those are things that will also be inspected to make sure that they stay intact. It's just a little bit different type of maintenance, less intrusive than maintaining and watching the grass barrier. So they will also maintain that in any area that doesn't contain a building. Basically, there will be no way for a person on this property to touch the contaminated soil because it will either be covered by green space with the orange fabric, or it will be covered by a pavement, a hard surface pavement, or it will be covered by a building. On the right-hand side of the screen is an example of an excavator removing soil. This is essentially what's going to happen in the building footprints themselves. So that contaminated fill material is completely removed from the building footprint. So there's no possible way for contamination to be, inhaled or breathed up through the building because it's gone. It's been removed. There will be no fill material remaining. That is the mitigation plan for the breathing pathway. And the developer plans to do that by digging through the material. It's easy to tell the difference between the fill material that may have some debris, like chunks of brick and concrete and things like that mixed into it, versus the native clay material that is typically present in the city of Detroit and in the region. So it's something easily verified through watching during the digging to make sure it's removed. Like if you're thinking about, I mean, I don't know, I can't think of an example off the top of my head right now to say, maybe it's like if you imagine a bathtub that has it's full of sand, you're removing the sand out of the bathtub and you're bringing clean material back in so that the sand is gone, the contamination is gone. So we talked about the direct contact exposure barriers. So this is either the pavement or the buildings, or it's the vegetated area with the orange fabric. Those areas are going to be in the dotted shaded areas around the buildings again, and the pavement areas are the dark gray areas where you'll see, will be asphalt or concrete pavement or the walkways that kind of connect the buildings. So all of those areas will be considered an exposure barrier to prevent touching the contaminated soil. I've got a couple things here. We talked about pavements. We talked about the 12 inches of clean soil over that bright orange fabric. And they have to do their regular inspections. And if damage is ever noted, it has to be repaired. The documentation will be maintained by the owner. That is a requirement under the law. When we talked about excavating out of the building foundations, I highlighted these in yellow so you can clearly see these are kind of my bathtub areas where the contaminated soil is going to be excavated until the fill is gone and the native material, the clay that's always been there, is visible. It will just be in these areas so it removes any hazard from breathing it into an enclosed building. The depth is not specified at this point, and that's okay because it really depends on when they get out there and start this excavation process and determining in some areas, maybe they have to dig a little deeper to get to that native clay and remove all that fill material. And in other areas, it may be a little less shallow. So they don't need to specify a depth right now. They've told us that they're going to use visual observation and remove all the fill material so that it's gone. They are also going to collect some soil samples once that fill material is gone and you essentially can see the hole is open. They're going to get some samples from that native clay and send those to the laboratory, similarly to how they've collected samples in the past. And those samples should verify that there are no contaminants remaining at an unsafe level in that soil. So it just verifies the removal, and that's a way that we have to show part of the documentation that that hazard has been removed. They're also, as I talked about, bringing clean backfill back into these building footprints. So when they finish out the building pads and they start the construction and pouring the slabs and adding all the components to the building, they'll be building on clean backfill material that's been tested and sampled before it's arrived on the site to make sure there are no contaminants present that could cause at a level that could cause a hazard to someone in the building. As another part of what their mitigation plan is, we talked about notices and how they're going to do notices for this property to tell the people that need to know where the contamination is and how to protect themselves from that. So under our law, it requires that a developer or owner, actually, like I talked about before, the owner or operator of the property has to notify all owners and operators of public utilities that serve the property. So they'll be notifying the Detroit Water and Sewer Department. They'll be notifying the city in other measures so that if there's ever, a utility repair or something that has to come out to the site to fix something, they know that they need to put on protective equipment to prevent themselves from being exposed. This is for any owner operator of contaminated property in the state of Michigan. They have to tell people who might come out there for construction that they need to protect themselves. It also notifies residents that there is there are exposure barriers present that have been constructed on this property. Those barriers are there to prevent any harm to come from people from touching the contaminated soil. What they have proposed in their mitigation plan is that these notices will be part of a lease agreement on the property, and it will prohibit activities like digging into the clean soil to reach the fabric or gardening that may breach that fabric and cause that contaminated soil to be exposed. So our conclusions about the review of the response activity plan or RESAP is that this RESAP that's in front of us, it does summarize all the information that's known about the exposure hazards at this site, which is the breathing hazard and the touching hazard. Because again, we covered that no one can be exposed to this contamination by drinking because water supplied to the site will be city water. So those are the two pathways, exposure pathways where something could occur. That is going to be mitigated. There are plans now that show how they're going to prevent that from happening. The second piece is their proposed mitigation plans align with our guidance that we give out to the regulated community that says these are ways that you can protect users and owners of a property from being exposed to contamination that may be present. So those guidance documents have fancy names, but they are basically put out by us to tell the regulated community to give examples of how they can do these mitigation measures, and it tells them what our expectations are for preventing exposure. The third piece is we think that based on what is proposed in this plan, in this response activity plan, that as a result, if all of these activities are carried out, the owner or operator has a reasonable likelihood of being compliant with due care obligations. And this is kind of that funky, fancy phrase that I mentioned earlier in the presentation. That just means we think that if they do what's in their plan, the property will be used safely, and therefore they will be in compliance with their due care obligations under the law. So our next steps is we're still, as Mike indicated in the beginning of the presentation, we're still in that comment period. We will take written comments either by email or by mail, and we'll have that address later on the screen in the next slide. But that public comment period extends all the way out to January 30th. So you still have a month and a half to submit any written comments that you have on the response activity plan or the information that we've presented here tonight. The next step in the process is that we will respond to the comments that we've received so that folks understand that we've heard their information, we've heard their concerns, and so they understand what our plan is or how the response activity plan we believe will address their concerns. And then at the end of the period, we will be responding to the developer, who is in this case considered the submitter of the response activity plan, and we will let them know what our final decision is for that response activity plan. And they will know if it is approved or if it is not approved. So that will be the final step. I will say that the consultant and developer that prepared the response activity plan are on a good path. We think that they can reach approval, and we have communicated with them about how to get to that point, and we are comfortable with the plan that they have presented so far. So here's our ways to submit your written comments to us. And again, this does not end until January 30th, so you still got plenty of time. You can email those comments to me. My email address is shown right there on the screen, thompsonm31@michigan.gov. Or you can mail me your comments by old-fashioned snail mail if you want to do that. And that is also here. The address here is the EGLE headquarters in Lansing. So now I will turn this back over to Mike so he can moderate Q&A.
Great. Thank you, Martha. And thank you, Carrie, for jumping in and asking a couple of those questions along the way. I have got a quick, as we start, how many people are watching the rotation? I got a quick poll, because I think we've got a few, we had about 24 people log in this evening. And so if you're watching with, a group of people or you're watching with some other folks, if you wouldn't mind just responding to the poll question that jumped up on your screen, that would be really helpful for us. I appreciate that. Thank you for all the questions throughout the presentation. A couple more that have come in. Martha, you talked about obviously like what their obligations are, and that it's their legal requirements to meet their due care obligations. What happens if the owner does not meet their due care obligations?
That's a good question. So if we become at EGLE become aware of information that the owner is not in compliance with their due care obligations, we have the authority under the law to request that documentation, and we would send a letter to the owner that says, Dear Mr. Smith, we understand there may be a potential concern here, may be a potential exposure, and therefore we are asking you to send us your documentation of all your records that you've made and all the actions that you've taken to be in compliance with your due care obligations. So they have an opportunity to share that with us. If we review that material and determine that they're not in compliance, or if for some reason there's no response or there's a negative part to that, we will then proceed to follow kind of a prescribed path to get them back into compliance. We always try to work with folks to do that, but ultimately it's, if we think there's an immediate risk, I don't think that would be the case here because these types of contaminants are not acute. In other words, if you are exposed to it in a short period of time, it's going to cause immediate harm. That's not what's present here. But we can compel them to take immediate action, or if they don't, we can spend state funds, taxpayer money to take that action and then recover that cost later on to the owner and operator. I will say that is rare. Usually, when we send these types of letters, if we become aware of a potential concern, the owners and operators immediately start their actions to comply and they send us all of their documentation that shows their pictures and their records and how they've maintained these things over the year. But we will then verify that to determine that yes, they are in compliance.
Great. Thank you.
Mhm.
Are you able to share what changes EGLE requested the developer make to their initial response activity plan?
Yes, I can share that. We reviewed the initial response activity plan. It also proposed the exposure barriers, which was in line with what I've talked about here. There was no change related to that. The largest change was related to the vapor pathway. So in other words, the breathing part. There were soil gas samples collected. So, in other words, where they went in, if you think about my example of the glass full of ice cubes, they measured the voids in between the ice cubes to see what was contained in the air in those voids. That sampling was completed. Unfortunately, it did not meet what we asked for in our guidance to demonstrate that they measured the fill material and the contamination in the fill material. So their alternate approach that was then available to them was excavating it out of the building footprints to completely remove it altogether. So unfortunately, their testing did not work out, but there's an alternate approach that they can follow to eliminate the hazard. And there were some other like minor things like just correcting maybe some typos or things like that that may have been present in the maps and the tables that we talked about before just to get things presented, accurately for the site. But they were pretty minor. But the biggest issue that we told them was, hey, the testing data doesn't demonstrate that the risk will not be there. And so your option is to remove it altogether to excavate it.
Great, thank you.
Mhm.
Will the developer have to submit a response activity plan for each phase of the project?
No, they will not need to do that. And to kind of touch back on one of the slides that Carrie shared before that where you had a yes column and a no column, EGLE doesn't decide the types of approvals that the developer needs. That's a decision that's made by the funding authorities. So in this case, entities like MSHDA, which is the Michigan State Housing Development Authority, and the City of Detroit's Housing and Revitalization Department, who is responsible for using federal funds on this property in addition to the state funds from MSHDA. So those are the two entities that tell the developers where EGLE approvals are required. And then when they send them to us, we review them and then provide a determination about whether or not that is approved. Um, from our perspective, they can change the plan if they decide to, but they have to demonstrate in the documentation of due care compliance, which is the second report that Carrie covered in the beginning, that that change is still equivalent, it is protective, and why that change was made. That's not typical. Usually, once these things are approved, the developer will carry out the plan that's in the Res app in front of us. And I think that's the intent of the developer in this case. So they don't need to do any more response activity plans unless their funding partners tell them that they need to do that.
Martha, if this is a multi-phase development, I think the response activity plan that we looked at, does it just cover a portion of the property and so if there were future phases of the development that were not included in this response activity plan, they would not fall under this approval though.
That is
They so
correct.
so they may have to come back in
Yes,
for approval for, another portion of the property that we haven't evaluated,
that is
correct?
a great point. That is a great point. This is just for phases 1A and 1B. So that little southeast corner of the overall um, large parcel that were on some of our slides before. So any future phases, if there's a phase 2, A, B, C, 3, 4, whatever they call them, those have to have their own response activity plans because those are not covered under this piece. If we grant approval, that would only apply to phases 1A and 1B that were outlined in some of our slides. Thank you for pointing that out. So yes, you could say that there will be future response activity plans for other areas of this overall development, but there may not necessarily be them future plans for what is under review today.
Great, thank you.
Mhm.
There was one question. I don't get to answer many of these, but there was one question that came in. There was somebody who was having issue with accessing the response activity plan in the website that I shared. If that is the case, one thing that you can always try is to try and disable your pop-up blocker. It automatically opens the plan in a separate window, and so sometimes that can get a little finicky. If you're still having issues, I'm going to volunteer myself. I'm going to volunteer Martha. You can respond to either one of us in an email. We'll connect you with our database specialist, and we'll make sure that you've got access to that plan. And I will, like I said, I'll be sending an email out to everybody who registered. So if we've got your email, I'll be able to respond to you with a link to the YouTube video for the recording tonight, and a copy of the slides. I will also send in the RIDE database email for that. So if you have questions or you have issues navigating that database, you can reach out there. So, any other questions from the group? Make sure you use the Q&A function in Zoom. I'm not seeing any. So again, Martha, if you wouldn't mind, can you jump back to the slide with your address and email address? Um, and then just a reminder that we've got the public comment period has been kicked out to January 30th. Um, I do see there's a long comment in here, and so it looks like just a comment that I appreciate. Thanking for the meeting. So, thank you, Martha. Thank you, Carrie. Nick, thanks for being on as backup in case any questions came your way. So just a reminder, folks, please make sure to, he had to get his face in there. That's nice. Reach out if you have comments on the response activity plan. You can email them directly to Martha. You can submit them in writing, via snail mail to, the address on your screen. Um, Here's a question that did come in just at the very end here. How safe is the soil if residents cannot maintain a garden? And I think maybe that question goes to like that you talked about the ongoing maintenance of these exposure barriers, the difference between like concrete sidewalk and the bare soil or the vegetation. And so how safe is the soil if residents cannot maintain a garden? Um,
Well, I think if we look back, we're looking at two different ways that that contamination can be exposed that can enter the body. So, what we're talking about is touching, that's what the exposure barrier prevents touching um, the contaminated soil because you got the orange fabric and then you got the clean stuff on top of it and the vegetation. The gardening piece is a different way. That's ingesting. So they're eating. Um, vegetables or food that are grown in the contaminated soil. So that those contaminants may transfer from the soil into the vegetable and then the person ingests it. I think it's unlikely that the owner would allow gardening in the ground at this property. That is very rare these types of communities that we see. And so that's a different route of exposure. And that's why the notices are there to tell the residents that they can't garden, that they can't dig into the soil that could potentially either touch it or plant something in it that could then allow the contaminants to go into the material that you would eat later, the vegetable. Hopefully that helps to explain it.
Thank you. Nick, I did see you jump back on. Did you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I was just going to add, I mean, it's really, and also to help kind of maintain that exposure barrier. I mean, when we develop these criteria and, what we consider safe and not, I mean, we're assuming repeated exposure, almost daily where there's no snow cover and also ingestion of the soil on a 350 days out of the year in that assumption. So we're assuming a so lots of repeated exposure for a 30-year duration. So really, what we're trying to do is just prevent this exposure and the gardening just kind of opens that up, starting to dig in the soil, plant things, use more that we could get some uptake and things that we don't necessarily, want to have happen. So, you know, if there's that barriers there, I'd say the soil is safe. There's just not there's unlikely to have any exposure, certainly not meeting our default assumptions that we make when we develop these numbers. And so, we're really preventing this, long-term exposure.
Great. Thank you. What happens if ownership of the property changes?
Well, that means that a new owner has the same requirements as the existing owner. So a new owner has to comply with all of the same things. If there are those exposure barriers are present, the new owner has to take over the inspections and the maintenance and all any repairs that need to take place to those things. And they are responsible for continuing that same level of effort moving forward forever, as long as that material is there and could cause a potential harm.
Great, thank you. Um, does the response activity plan get into the detail of trucks, construction equipment being decontaminated before leaving the site to ensure that they don't track contaminated soil into the surrounding neighborhoods elsewhere off the site?
It does not. Construction management is not really something that's under our ability to um, regulate in that piece and what we do and Carrie, if you remember Carrie's slides from the different parts of EGLE, we're concerned with contaminated soil and contaminated groundwater as it sits on the property. I will say that most all of these developers and contractors that I'm aware of that work on these properties are taking the appropriate actions to prevent that from being tracked off site, but we are not the agency that verifies that piece. So that would be the responsibility either of another division of EGLE that regulates that, or possibly one of, for example, the city of Detroit may have individuals that are responsible for monitoring conditions during construction and after that to verify that these measures were taken. They're definitely best management practices. It's just not within our authority, our window in this response activity plan.
Great, thank you. And it looks like one last question here on the mechanism on how contamination might move in the site. So we talk about right the vegetation that's being planted. Is it possible for the contamination on this site to be taken up by the contamination and somehow else released, into the air, somehow else released to residents?
Nick, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah. So the contamination here, the benzoate pyrene, it really likes soil. And, Martha indicated these are semi-volatile. So the only way for these really to move up is really through the vapor phase. This really doesn't want to exist that way. And if it does, it would come out and go in the ambient air and be diluted. But this really likes to be in the soil. It really isn't, it's kind of bound there. It's not really moving. It's not going to come up. The mechanism for it to migrate, if anywhere, is down, particularly, but here in these clayey soils, we just don't see that migration. It's pretty much kind of locked in that location. So covering it basically kind of keeps it right there and again, it eliminates that exposure.
Great, thank you.
Mhm.
Well, I appreciate it. I don't see any other questions coming in, so I appreciate the last little push there from folks. Thanks again for taking the time out of your evening to really be here and engage with us and contribute to this whole process. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Keep an eye out in your emails for a follow-up note from me. And if anything else comes up, you'll hear. We'll keep your emails on file. We'll be able to share as much as we can. But yeah, absolutely, make sure you submit your written comments. Anything else, Martha or Carrie, before we sign off? Great.
No, just thank you so much for participating tonight. We really appreciate your interest in this site and look forward to hearing your comments.
And we appreciate your thoughtful questions. And hopefully, my examples gave you the answer you were looking for. If it did not, please reach out to me.
Great. Well, thanks everybody. Have a great evening, and we will talk soon.